Your Honor, may we approach the witness with the exhibit binder, please?
That would be fine.
Good morning, Dr. Egan.
Good morning.
My name is Dr. A. Patterson. I'm sorry. My name is Peter A. Patterson. I'll be asking you something.
Take it back. It's okay.
That'd be great.
Take it from me.
Okay.
From the judge.
Thank you.
Very well. Mr. Patterson, you may cross-examine.
Your Honor, may we approach the witness with the exhibit binder, please?
That would be fine.
Good morning, Dr. Egan.
Good morning.
My name is Dr. Peter. I did it again. I'm sorry. We're going to do this one more time, and that'll be the last one.
We'll go again.
Thank you. Long. There we go.
Very well. Mr. Patterson, you may cross-examine.
Your Honor, may we approach the witness with the exhibit binder, please?
That would be fine.
Good morning, Dr. Egan.
Good morning.
My name is Peter A. Patterson. I'll be asking you some questions on behalf of the defendant intervenor. First, I'd like to start with the economic activity that you believe will be generated in San Francisco on account of same-sex marriages being allowed. And you testified that San Francisco currently incurs costs because these, in the forms of foregone sales tax and hotel tax revenues on account of same-sex couples not being able to get married. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You have attempted to estimate, at least for the short term, the new consumer spending that would generate these revenues that same-sex marriage would generate on an annualized basis in the city and county of San Francisco. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
You have not attempted to quantify the long-term impact, correct?
That's correct.
And you've not attempted to quantify the impact of domestic partnerships on San Francisco's economy. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and Dr. Egan, are you aware if gays and lesbians may currently have religious and other wedding ceremonies and celebrations, even though they are not permitted to obtain a civil marriage license?
I'm actually not aware of that. I don't know.
Do you think it's reasonable to assume that they do?
That they're allowed to have religious...
That they're permitted to have religious wedding ceremonies even though they're not permitted to obtain a civil marriage license?
I guess I would assume that's reasonable, yes.
And is it reasonable to assume that some of them actually do have those types of ceremonies and celebrations?
I would guess so, yes.
But you have no account for any economic impact that's generated from those currently, have you?
That's correct. I suppose one reason might be I don't have account of them, whereas I have account on legal marriages.
And do you know if gays and lesbians that have such celebrations, were they permitted to civilly marry, would they have another one?
It's difficult for me to put myself in their shoes there.
Right. So your report essentially assumes that every gay and lesbian couple that gets married will have a wedding ceremony or celebration. Is that correct?
The analysis depends if that there is an average expenditure on weddings associated with each wedding, yes.
So that implicitly assumes that each of them has.
No, it assumes that on average this is the average expenditure. It doesn't assume everyone hits exactly the average.
Okay. Now, you've based your short-term estimates on San Francisco's experience from June 17th, 2008 to November 4th, 2008. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you implicitly assume that the same number of same-sex couples will get married, at least in short term, at a similar rate as they did during that time period. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you recognize that the rate that occurred during that period was partially due to a pent-up demand for same-sex marriage. Is that correct?
In the sense that there were a number of same-sex couples who were unable to get married and wanted to be married quickly. Yes, that's correct.
And that means that the rate that occurred during that time frame was inflated to some extent due to that pent-up demand. Is that correct?
By inflated, do you mean relative to some future rate?
Yes.
Yes, that's right.
But you believe that that pent-up demand was not satisfied during that time period in 2008. Is that correct?
That's correct. Well, I'm simply assuming that there will be the same rate of a marriage if it's legalized again, yes.
So that would be if pent-up demand was not satisfied.
To the extent that that includes pent-up demand, yes, you are correct.
Your assumption that there is a pent-up demand on same-sex marriage is based simply on your opinion living in the city and observing the interest in it among same-sex couples. Is that correct?
I didn't use a concept of pent-up demand in my analysis. I simply said if same-sex marriage is legalized again, it's reasonable to me you would see the same level of activity that you did when it was last legal.
I believe you testified a little differently at your deposition. If you could turn to tab 2 in the binder on page 29, starting at line 24. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Yeah, starting at line 24, and the question is, so what is your basis for thinking there is a pent-up demand for same-sex marriage? And then, if you would go down to line 9 on the following page, you testified, I simply thought it was reasonable to presume there was a pent-up demand for same-sex marriages in San Francisco, just from living in the city and observing the interest in it among many same-sex couples. Did you give that testimony in your deposition?
Well, those are my words. I'm trying to reconstruct the context.
Yeah, yes or no? Did you?
Yes.
And your basis for assuming that this pent-up demand was not satisfied from June 17, 2008 to November 4, 2008 is that, to the best of your recollection, there were pending marriage appointments in the county clerk's office that were scheduled after November 4, 2008. Is that correct?
Yes, that's one reason.
Okay. If you could, please turn your attention to tab 22 in the witness binder. And this is an exhibit that has been marked PX 805, Plaintiff's Exhibit 805. Do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
And what is this document?
This is a summary of marriage license appointments and actual marriage licenses issued by the San Francisco County Clerk.
Your Honor, we move this PX 805 into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
805 is admitted.
Dr. Egan, from June 17, 2006 to June 30th, or 2008, June 30th, 2008, how much marriage license appointments for same-sex couples does the court report?
This document says 1,080.
But from July 1st to July 31st?
897.
Mm-hmm. September 1st?
I think we can read the numbers. Let's just go on to the next question.
Okay. The question is, how about from November 5th to November 30th?
56.
Mm-hmm. And that's quite a bit lower than the number of marriage appointments that were pending during the same during the same time. Excuse me, so that's quite a bit lower than the number of marriage appointments that were pending during the time same-sex marriages were legal. Is that correct?
I think you can ask the witness whether he sees a trend.
It's a lower number. But the only reason I hesitate in giving that is, as an answer, is that this is as of November 24th. And I don't know how many people canceled their appointment between November 5th and November 24th when the document was prepared.
Okay. Well, this particular document doesn't provide much evidence that the pent-up demand was similar after. It was not satisfied during the time same-sex marriage was legal. Does it?
If you're asking me to believe that there was a great deal of pent-up demand from October 20th to November 4th when there were 1,000 appointments, but somehow it ended right at that point and there was no pent-up demand as of November 5th, I would just say this is not an indicator of pent-up demand.
Well, you gave as your testimony, did you not, that the pending marriage appointments, license appointments, were an indicator that pent-up demand was not satisfied. Is that correct?
The fact that anyone had an appointment to get married after November 4th indicates that there are at least some couples who wish to get married. I would not say that it's an exhaustive list.
Right, but you distinguished between pent-up demand and some sort of demand that would obtain in the long term. Is that correct?
Pent-up demand is not a concept that I used in my analysis. I'm simply saying that in the short term, if same-sex marriage were legal again, we would see a similar experience to what we saw in 2008.
Right. But what you have said is you would expect that for a period of time the marriage rate would be elevated, and long term it would go to some more steady state level. Is that correct?
That's correct. Mm-hmm. That's a good way to put it.
Okay. And as evidence that the rate would continue at the rate it did before November 4, 2008, you gave that there were marriage license appointments pending. Is that correct?
That is one indicator, yes.
Right. Now, this does not support an assertion that marriage appointments would continue at a similar rate after November 4, 2008 than it did before, does it?
Well, it doesn't if you believe that this is 100% of the pent-up demand.
Could you clarify that, please?
Yes. I mean, it seems to me that suppose you were a suppose you were in a same-sex relationship and you wanted to get married after November 5th. You would be classified as the way we have been talking about it, as pent-up demand. That doesn't lead me to believe you would go to the county clerk and make an appointment. So the list of outstanding county clerk appointments indicates that there are at least some couples who wish to get married. But you wouldn't think that every couple that wished to get married would make an appointment for something that couldn't happen.
But it doesn't indicate that couples would get married at the same rate after November 4th as it did before, does it?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
It indicates that some same-sex couples would get married after November 4th. I'm not questioning that at all. I'm assuming same-sex couples would if they were permitted to get married. But it doesn't indicate that they would get married at the same rate as they did before November 4th, does it?
But it's not an indicator of those who will get married or want to get married. It's simply evidence of some.
Okay.
In other words, the marriage licenses, when it's legal, are because you're able to get married. Or they're a fairly accurate measure of the demand for marriage. The number after you can't get married are not. I think that would be an important distinction.
Right. And I'm asking you what you're basing your opinion on. That the number after November 4th, 2008 would be comparable to that before. And this is one of the indicators you gave me. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it is an indication that there are some people who, even after Proposition 8 passed, had existing marriage license appointments.
Okay.
And if I could give you a slightly deeper answer, it's the only actual quantitative information that I could have given you in response to your question at the deposition. I don't know how many same-sex couples in San Francisco want to get married now because there is no way to register that.
Okay, fair enough. Now, as we've been discussing here, been calling pent-up demand or this elevated rate of marriages that were obtained for the short term, you believe that this will last for several years. Is that correct?
I use the term several years in my expert report, yes.
But you cannot quantify it beyond the term several years. Is that correct?
That's right, because I don't have a clear sense of what's pent-up demand and what is the factors that go into what you term the steady state rate.
And you can't even say it would be less than 10 years. Is that correct?
That's, I cannot put a number to it, yes.
Okay, you can't say it would be less than 20 years?
That's correct.
Please turn to tab 3 in the witness binder. This is a document that's been marked Plaintiff's Exhibit 815, PX 815. And do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
What is this document?
This is a report that I prepared in 2008 at the request of a member of our Board of Supervisors to estimate what the 3-year impact of legalizing same-sex marriage might be on San Francisco's economy.
Your Honor, we would like to admit this in evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
815 is admitted.
All right, you said this was done at the request of a member of the Board of Supervisors. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Your office typically does not review statewide legislation. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you believe that the Board of Supervisors members who requested this wanted to know if the revenues of same-sex marriage would offset the cost of same-sex marriage. Is that correct?
I believe the request wanted to know the revenue impacts, to look at whether it made sense to add additional resources for the county clerk who had to process an elevated number of license and appointment requests.
So they thought they might have some additional staffing costs associated
Right.
with same-sex marriage. Is that correct? If you could turn to page 6 of this report, and this is a slide titled Assumptions, San Francisco Resident Weddings. And can you please read the first sentence of the first bullet point on that page?
Yes, it says, based on the experience of Massachusetts, we project that 28% of San Francisco same-sex couples will marry in fiscal year 2008 to 09, and 9% in fiscal year 2009 to 10, a 67% drop.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What I'm interested in is this 67% drop in same-sex marriages that you assumed from the first year to the second year of its availability. For your opinion in this case, you have not factored in any drop from the time period in 2008 when same-sex marriage was legal until the time when same-sex marriage is permitted again. Is that correct?
That's right.
And you've said that that rate that obtained in 2008 would last for several years, and you've not projected any drop between those years. Is that correct?
That's right. I have not attempted to quantify that drop.
Is this report, in this report, which you did for a member of San Francisco Board of Supervisors, you did project a drop. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So now, if you could turn to tab 4 of the witness binder, and this is a document that's been marked Plaintiff's Exhibit 1734. Can you identify this document? And if you would like, at the same time, to look at what has been behind tab 5, that is PX 1735, I believe those two documents taken together. They represent all the marriages that took place in San Francisco during the time period same-sex marriage was legal. Is that right?
I believe you're correct.
Your Honor, we would like to admit these two, move two documents, PX 1734, PX 1735, into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
Perhaps you can have the witness explain how one should read these.
Yes.
Are you planning to do that, Mr. Patterson?
Yes.
All right, fine.
So this is information the county clerk's office provided you with respect to marriages in San Francisco. Is that correct?
Uh-huh.
And it's my understanding that there is an entry in those documents for each marriage that took place in San Francisco from June 17, 2008 to November 4th, 2008. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, too.
And it's broken down, first of all, there are two documents. My understanding is that one of them is confidential weddings, and one of them is weddings that are on the public record. Is that correct?
That's why there are two documents, yes.
Okay, and the information in each of these documents, the weddings are broken down between San Francisco resident weddings, San Francisco resident same-sex couples, non-San Francisco resident same-sex couples, and then opposite-sex couples. Is that correct?
I would have to refresh my recollection about the ordering,
Okay.
but
Well, if it would help you refresh your recollection, if you look at PX 1735, that one has page number. That one has a page number on it, so it's a little easier for me to ask you to flip through that one. That's behind tab 5, and then on page 42 of that.
yes.
Okay. It says same-sex inside San Francisco. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay. It's cut off, but that's what you understand.
yes.
So everything above that would be same-sex marriages that occurred inside San Francisco.
That's correct.
And if you turn to page 90, about a third of the way down the page, do you understand that represents same-sex outside of San Francisco? Yes. Okay. And then if you turn to page 142, which I believe is the last page of the document, it says opposite sex. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And is it your understanding that the other document has these listed in the same order? And this one doesn't have page numbers, but it's on the 5th page. Is where the first. Okay. Is where the first cutoff takes place.
It's organized in the same way.
Okay.
Yes.
For each wedding, would you agree that it includes the city and state residents for each partner to the marriage?
Yes.
Okay. And so with these documents, you would determine the proportion of out-of-state couples that came to California to get married during this time period. Is that correct?
Yes.
Or came to San Francisco, sorry.
No.
And you would not permitted to do so in this report, is that correct?
I believe the distinction we made in our analysis is resident, non-resident, and not in-state, out-of-state. Yes.
Okay. Now, if you could turn to tab 6 of this binder, and this is a document that's been marked PX 1736. And this is data, first of all. Can you identify this document?
Yes. This is a summary of the reports we were just examining. This summarizes them by whether it's an opposite-sex or same-sex marriage and the location of the residence of the partners.
Your Honor, we would move to admit PX 1736.
No objection, Your Honor.
Very well. 1736 is admitted.
Okay, now let's start with San Francisco residents, same-sex marriages. From June 17th to November 4th, 2008, there were 2,331 San Francisco resident same-sex marriages. Is that correct?
Yes.
And your annualized calculations are based on basically dividing the activity that took place during this time period by 0.38 to arrive at an annualized figure. Is that correct?
Right, because the period in 2008 that same-sex marriage was legal represents 38% of 2008.
Okay. Your Honor, I'd like to use a demonstrative. I'd like to use a demonstrative to ask the next several questions.
Very well.
Okay. So this is the first slide. And we just established that 2,331 same-sex marriages between San Francisco residents took place in 2008. Is that correct?
Yes, we just did.
Okay. And that using your methodology, you would have to divide by 0.38 to get the annualized figure. Is that correct? So we move to slide 2, please. I've done the math here. 2,331 divided by 0.38 equals 6,134. Does that look right to you?
That, I trust your math on that.
Okay. And you said that marriages would continue at this rate for several years. So I'm going to assume several would be at least 2. Is that correct?
Again, I can't attach a number to it.
Right.
Because I don't have a sense of what the...
But several generally is more than 1. Is that correct?
It's more than 1.
Okay. So then after 2 years, using your methodology, you would project that in addition to 2,331 San Francisco couples that got married in 2008, there would be 6,134 times 2. Is that correct?
Yes.
So can we move to the next slide? So that would be after 2 years, if same-sex marriage were legalized again, we would have 14,599 San Francisco resident same-sex marriages. Is that correct?
Uh-huh.
Okay, if you could please turn to tab 7 in your witness binder. This is a document that's been marked Plaintiff's Exhibit 817. Do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and could you describe what this document is?
Yeah, this is a table from the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey.
And you relied on this table in preparing your expert report?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, we would like to move this PX 817 into evidence.
No objection.
817 is admitted.
Now, could you tell me how many male couple households this Census Bureau report estimates there are in San Francisco?
Do you mean unmarried partner households where there's a male household or a male partner?
Yes, I do.
That's 7,033.
And could you tell me how many female households of similar type were their reports?
That's 2,591.
That's okay. I'll represent to you. That's a total of 9,624. Does that sound correct?
Yes.
So you understand this to be estimated that there are 9,624 same-sex couples living in San Francisco. Is that correct?
There were, on an average, during the 3 years that were covered by the census, yes.
And in light of that, do you think it's reasonable to assume that after 2 more years of same-sex marriage, there would be 14,599 San Francisco resident same-sex couples that would get married in San Francisco?
Well, I wouldn't be able to comment on the reasonableness of that unless I knew something about the migration rate in and out of San Francisco of gay and lesbian individuals, and I knew something about the rate of couple formation. If, for example, these 9,000 or so have either gotten married or are no longer unmarried, or have moved out of San Francisco, or their partnerships have dissolved, there could very well be, over the next 2 years, an additional 14,000 new sets of couples that might wish to get married. Again, but this is one reason why I didn't attach a number of years to it, because I don't have that necessary information to make a long-term calculation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you think it would have been, informative to compare the number of marriages you estimate projects with the population of same-sex couples in San Francisco?
I think if I had wanted to quantify the length of time that I thought that short-term projection would apply, well, actually, no, because I'm not sure. I think by itself, this is not a good predictor of the number of weddings in San Francisco, because you need to know how many couples there are in a given year who are ready to get married. Mm-hmm. And that has to do with the dynamics of migration and the dynamics of household formation or couple formation.
Can I ask you to look at tab 8 in the witness binder now, please? This is an exhibit that has been marked PX 818, the impact of extending marriage to same-sex couples on the California budget. It's a Williams Institute report. Do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and do you rely on this document in preparing your expert opinion in this case?
Yes, I did.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you would turn to page 4, the second sentence of the second paragraph says, approximately 9,695 same-sex couples married in Massachusetts during the first 3 years they were allowed to do so, constituting at least 44% of Massachusetts same-sex couples as counted in the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And is it correct that your projection assumes that over 100% of San Francisco same-sex couples, as counted by the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey, would get married after 2 years were same-sex marriage permitted?
Well, the Census Bureau doesn't count the number of couples over a 2-year period. It counts the number of couples at one point in time.
Right.
And report it for that year.
But this is Williams Institute report.
Yes.
Used the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey to determine what percentage of Massachusetts same-sex couples got married during the first 3 years they were allowed to do so. Is that correct?
Right.
And that is the same methodology I just walked you through with respect to your projections. Is that correct?
Objection, vague.
Objection overruled.
Which methodology are you referring to?
The methodology of seeing how many weddings your methodology would assume occurred in San Francisco during the next 2 years was the period that I selected. And then using the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey estimates as basically a denominator to figure out the percentage of same-sex couples that represents.
Is that what the Williams Institute did, and is that the same thing that I've walked you through?
Well, the Williams Institute has compared the number of same-sex couples who were married in Massachusetts during the first 3 years that they were allowed to do so, with an estimate of the total number of same-sex couples in Massachusetts as reported by the American Community Survey. And you have extrapolated my estimate to produce a 2-year estimate and compared it to the American Community Survey for San Francisco's estimate of same-sex couples.
And what actually happened in Massachusetts after 3 years was 44% of same-sex couples got married. Is that correct, as so estimated?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
And your projections assume that over 100% of San Francisco same-sex couples will get married. Is that correct, using those same parameters?
Again, I don't believe that that is a correct measure necessarily of the number of potential weddings that could take place because of the issue of how couple formation and migration that I've already discussed.
I'm not asking you if it's a correct way to analyze it. I'm asking you if that is the result of that analysis, that over 100% was counted that way.
Yes.
Okay. Now, you claim that revenue will be generated from the marriages of same-sex residents, same-sex couples in the form of hotel tax revenues and sales tax revenues. Is that correct?
Yes.
Hotel tax revenues are generated when non-resident guests of same-sex couples travel to San Francisco to attend weddings. Is that correct?
As well as when non-resident couples travel to San Francisco to marry.
I'd like you to just now focus on San Francisco resident same-sex weddings for this series of questions. And sales tax will be generated by the per diem spending of these out-of-town guests. Is that correct?
Yes.
And sales tax will also be generated by retail expenditures the same couples make on their weddings. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you assume that out-of-town guests will attend weddings of San Francisco resident same-sex couples. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you haven't attempted to determine how many out-of-town guests actually attended such weddings in 2008, have you?
No.
You haven't attempted to determine how many those of guests actually stayed at hotels. Is that correct?
No. I would have no way to imagine that information was obtainable.
So you simply picked a number to estimate that figure. Is that correct?
Well, as you do when you make economic projections. We made some very conservative assumptions about the relative size of same-sex weddings and the number of guests who might stay from out of town. We assumed only 10% of wedding guests would come from out of town, which seemed to me to be a fairly conservative assumption.
Okay. Now, with respect to wedding expenditures by San Francisco same-sex couples, you assume that the average taxable cost of the wedding for a resident same-sex couple is 25% of the wedding of an opposite-sex couple. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you have not studied the actual expenditures of same-sex couples on their weddings either. Is that correct?
No, we actually relied on the Williams Institute report that we've been referring to for that assumption.
Okay. If you could please turn back to tab 3 in the witness binder. And this is the Office of Economic Analysis report that we discussed earlier. If you could turn to page 6, please. It's the same slide we looked at before, and if you could read the first sentence of the third bullet, please.
They will spend an average of 25% of what different sex weddings cost in San Francisco, or $9,180 per wedding.
And by they, you mean same-sex couples?
Resident same-sex couples, that's correct.
And if you could read the second sentence of please.
The second sentence says, however, only 10% of this is assumed to count as new income for figuring in economic impact.
Continue with the third, please.
Most resident spending will simply be diverted from other expenditures and will not create a net economic impact.
You haven't made a similar assumption in this case, have you?
That's correct.
Your calculations assume that 100% of the expenditures San Francisco same-sex couples make on their weddings will constitute new spending. Is that correct?
Well, technically, I'm assuming that the 25% costs represent the new income that is generated. So reflected in the fact that the same-sex marriage impact number is less than the cost of an average opposite-sex wedding is considered that which is new income, and that's following the assumption made in the Williams Institute report correctly.
But for the report that you did as part of your official duties in the Office of Economic Analysis, you assumed that only 10% of the 25% would constitute new spending. Is that correct?
That's correct. I believe I misunderstood how the Williams Institute had made that assumption in their report.
Okay, fair enough. So we've been discussing San Francisco resident weddings. Let's now turn to out-of-state weddings. And if you could return to tab 6 of the witness binder. This reports that there were 2,821 non-San Francisco resident same-sex marriages that took place in 2008. Is that correct? Between same-sex couples?
Yes.
And some of these were from within California, but out of San Francisco. And some were from out of the state and even in different countries. Is that correct?
Yes.
You've not distinguished between any of those categories. Is that correct?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you know since November 4th, 2008, have there been any additional jurisdictions that have permitted same-sex couples get married?
I don't recall the details on that, no.
Since what date?
Any additional jurisdictions?
No, the date.
Oh, November 4th, 2008. I'll represent to you that there are a number of jurisdictions that have permitted same-sex couples to get married after November 4th, 2008. During that time period, Massachusetts had allowed out-of-state couples to get married for a short period of time. That was the only other jurisdiction. Now, I believe 4 other jurisdictions permit same-sex couples to be married. Do you think those types of changes could have an impact on the number of out-of-state same-sex couples that come to California, San Francisco, in particular, to get married?
It might have an impact, although among the locations from which people traveled to San Francisco to marry were places that were quite adjacent to, or in some cases perhaps even in, jurisdictions where they could already marry. San Francisco is a tourism destination as well as a place to get married, and I'm certain that many out-of-state couples came to San Francisco for the tourism dimension, and that would probably continue.
Your report assumes that such changes would have no effect. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You
know, there are many other potential changes that could affect the number that also don't go in there. There may be more same-sex couples forming in other states. There may be more couples wishing to get married. I don't consider that either. It's a fairly simple methodology, actually.
Okay. And now I'm going to ask you a hypothetical, or pose a hypothetical scenario to you, and that is, assume that same-sex marriage is legal in all 50 states. In that scenario, would you expect the percentage of out-of-state couples coming to California to get married to decrease from what we saw in 2008?
To California or to San Francisco?
To San Francisco.
I'm not sure that would necessarily reduce the number. I can see your point, but I would say it depends on the number of same-sex couples wishing to get married across the U.S., and I don't know that that's a fixed number.
But you, as you stated, you've not taken any of that into account.
That's correct.
Okay, if you could please go back to tab 3 in the witness binder again. The Office of Economic Analysis report that you put together. And this time I want you to turn to the 7th page. And this is an assumption that your office made about an assumption your office made about out-of-state resident weddings. And in the first bullet point you state, you project that the second year total will be 67% less than the first year total. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And that's the same as you did for the inside San Francisco weddings in this in the report you did for the Board of Supervisors. Is that correct?
Yes.
And similarly, you've not done that in your report for this court. Is that correct?
Not done what?
You've not assumed that there will be a year-to-year decrease in the rate of same-sex couples getting married.
That's correct.
And 67% is actually a fairly large decrease from year to year. Is that correct?
Well, I was following in this 2008 report the methodology of the Williams Institute as closely as I could. The reason I did not follow that methodology for my expert report for this case was that methodology from the 2008 report substantially underestimated the number of same-sex marriages that we actually had. So rather than attempt to replicate that methodology, which had undercounted what we had, I felt it would be more straightforward to simply extrapolate San Francisco's experience during the multi-month period of time.
Now, same-sex marriage was not legal in San Francisco for a multi-year period of time. Is that correct?
That's right.
So there wasn't really evidence to deviate from 1 year to the next estimate of what would happen. Is that correct?
Right. That's based on the Williams Institute report, which does look at multi-year experience within Massachusetts.
Okay. Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief break, if I may.
How much longer do you have with this witness?
I would say I'm about halfway through, Your Honor.
Okay. Maybe a break, like your colleague, Mr. Thompson, will reduce the length somewhat.
Okay.
That, I'm sure, would be helpful to everybody. All right. Shall we take 15 minutes of the hour at 10:45?
Your Honor, just before we break, may I ask one minor housekeeping matter?
Yes.
Point of clarification, actually, and it's further to your announcement as we open the court day, that the court was asking for withdrawal of this case from the pilot program. I just asked the court for clarification, if I may then understand that the recording of these proceedings has been halted, the tape recording itself?
No, that has not been altered.
As the court knows, I'm sure we have put in a letter to the court asking that the recordings of the proceedings be halted. I do believe that in the light of the stay, that the court's local rule would prohibit continued tape recording of the proceedings.
I don't believe so. I read your letter. It does not quote the local rule. The local rule permits remote. Perhaps if we get the local rule?
Your Honor, I have a copy.
There we go. The local rule permits the recording for purposes of taking the recording for purposes of use in chambers, and that is customarily done when we have these remote courtrooms or the overflow courtrooms. And I think it would be quite helpful to me in preparing the findings of fact to have that recording. So that's the purpose for which the recording is going to be going forward hereafter. It's not going to be for purposes of public broadcasting or televising. And you will notice the local rule states that the taking of photographs, public broadcasting, or televising or recording for these purposes. So the recording is not being made for those purposes, but simply for use in chambers.
Very well, Your Honor, and I appreciate that clarification.
All right. Very well, Mr. Patterson, please continue.
Very well, Your Honor. Dr. Egan, we were speaking about the revenues you project San Francisco weddings, the out-of-state or out of San Francisco same-sex couples would generate. And again, one source of those revenues come from hotel taxes. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And you've assumed how long the non-San Francisco resident same-sex couples would stay in San Francisco when they got married. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And once again, you've not done any study of how long non-San Francisco resident same-sex couples actually stay in San Francisco when they come here to get married. Is that correct?
Well, no. On the first time for my 2008 report, same-sex marriage had just become legal, and there was no data about it. And for this expert report, again, it's not legal, so there is nothing to study, so I had to make an assumption.
You could study what occurred during 2008. Is that correct?
Had I known that I would have had to study it, perhaps I could have put in some survey, yes, but I didn't do that.
And again, another source of revenue you cite is sales tax generated by per diem spending and wedding-related expenditures. Is that correct?
Yes.
And with respect to the wedding-related expenditures for non-San Francisco resident couples, you've once again followed the Williams Institute methodology. Is that correct?
In terms of the wedding expenditures?
By non-San Francisco resident same-sex couples.
I believe that's right, yes.
So you haven't done any independent research on that?
No.
Mm-hmm. So adding all these additional revenues that you've identified, I believe you testified San Francisco would gain $2.7 million of annual increased tax revenues. Is that correct?
I believe that's roughly correct, yes.
Okay, and you've not considered any costs San Francisco would incur to administer these additional marriages. Is that correct?
The costs the city and county would incur are reimbursed by the license fees, so that is not a net cost to the city.
You haven't considered whether the city and county would have to engage additional staffing to administer these wedding fees? These weddings then?
The fees pay for the staff. So there again, there was no net cost. The fees are intended to reimburse the city's cost for providing the licenses.
So you've determined that the fees as they are now would in fact reimburse the city's costs if these additional marriages took place?
Well, that's correct. I haven't independently verified that, but that's the purpose of those fees, and that's why I didn't consider that as a separate category of economic impact.
And you testified that the motivating factor behind the Board of Supervisors asking you to analyze the effect of Prop 8 was to determine whether the costs would cover the additional fees of administering the weddings. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct. It was to estimate the number of weddings so that the extra staffing resources could be needed, not to adjust the size of the fee.
Okay. So is your testimony that if the cost or if the revenue generated from the fees was not sufficient, then the city would simply raise the fees so that it would be sufficient to cover the cost of administering these weddings?
The city sets fees to ensure cost recovery. It's by no means clear that the fees would need to increase because you have more people paying the fees, therefore you have more resources to hire more staff. It's the way this is accounted for is each clerk can handle so many during a day, and it's a linear thing, so it's not at all clear that the fees would need to change.
You did not analyze that?
That's correct.
Okay, and you've not considered any additional costs with, printing additional marriage license?
That's also covered by fees.
Would San Francisco have to alter the forms for their marriages? Were same-sex couples allowed to marry?
That is another thing that the fee is designed to reimburse the city for.
Okay. You simply have not accounted for any of that?
That's correct.
Okay. Please turn to tab 9 in the witness binder. And this is a document that's been marked Defendant Intervenors Exhibit 852. Do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and what is this document?
This is an email thread that concludes with a response I sent to Margaret Singh, who works in the city's 311 Customer Service Center.
And based on this email thread, my understanding is that a caller to the Customer Service Center had asked what the financial impact of Prop 8 would be on the city and county San Francisco. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you answered that Prop 8 would result in $415,000 in lost taxes and fees. Is that correct?
That's what the email says, yes.
And you wrote that email?
That's correct.
Okay. And that's quite a bit lower than the estimate you provided in the court in your opinion, today. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Your Honor, we would move admission DIX 852 into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
852D852 is admitted.
Yes. Okay. I'd like to turn to lost revenue from higher federal taxes and foregone federal benefits, which was another one of your opinions in this case. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you testified earlier that federal law would have to change before San Francisco and California permitting same-sex couples to marry would have this effect. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. So, and you recognize that some same-sex couples would pay more in federal taxes if they were permitted to marry. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay. And so your estimates depend on, how many pay less as compared to how many same-sex couples would pay more. Is that correct?
As well as the magnitude, yes.
As well as the magnitude. Correct. Okay. And your estimates of the amount, the relative amounts that fall into those categories and the magnitude are based on calculations by plaintiff's expert, Dr. Baguette. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. You haven't done any independent verifications or analysis of those calculations. Is that correct?
No, I have not.
So we would ask her any questions about those. Is that about the underlying validity of those? Is that correct?
Yes, you may.
Okay, and one thing you've done is estimated how many same-sex couples married would be residing in San Francisco if they were permitted to marry. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you assume that the percentage of same-sex couples that would marry would eventually equal the percentage of opposite-sex couples that would marry. Is that correct?
That's my assumption, yes.
And do you attach a time frame for how long it would take for that to take place?
I don't know how long that would take.
Have you attempted to determine how long that would take place?
No, it's not necessary for the conclusion that I reach.
Okay, and for the conclusion that you reach when the city would obtain the benefit that you identify would only be when the estimate of same-sex couples that you estimate would get married or were married. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you based your assumption that these percentages would eventually be equal just on an assumption that the only difference between same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples is that same-sex couples currently face legal barriers to marriage. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Have you studied the experience of these jurisdictions that have permitted same-sex couples to marry to determine if your predictions has borne out?
Not for the purposes of this piece of this analysis. I did not.
And so you don't know if your assumption is consistent with that experience?
No.
And you're not an expert on same-sex relationships. Is that correct?
I wouldn't put myself forward as an expert on same-sex relationships. However, When you do economic analysis, you have to make assumptions, and you try to make ones that are as reasonable as possible and are as informed as possible.
So you haven't done any independent study on whether gay and lesbian relationships differ in any way from opposite sex relationships?
No.
And I'd like to ask you to turn to tab 1 in the witness binder, which is actually your expert report, and I would just like to refer you to table 4, which is, I believe, on the last page of that report.
Yes, I see it.
Okay, and this is where you calculate first you calculate the percentage of heterosexual couples that are married in San Francisco. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then you base your calculations of same-sex couples that would get married on that. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. And one of the figures in this table is the number of married heterosexual couples, and that is reported here as 103,707. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I'll represent to you that the American Community Survey data that you relied upon, that we looked at earlier, did not have this number on it. It had the number of unmarried heterosexual couples. So I'd like you to turn to tab 11 in the witness binder, and this is American Community Survey data, additional data from San Francisco for the same year as the data that you relied on. Looking at this, do you recognize that that is what the document is?
I have not seen this before, but it looks familiar.
Okay, Your Honor, we would move to admit, and this is marked Defendant Intervenor Exhibit 2558 in evidence.
Yeah, Your Honor, I believe the witness said he had not seen this before, but perhaps I missed that.
Well, I understand, but this appears to be a U.S. Census Bureau data. I think it can at least take judicial notice. Do you have any objection to that?
No, I have no objection.
Very well. 2558 is admitted.
Then on the first page, do you see the households by type table?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Do you see the married couple family entry on that table?
Yes, I do.
And is the estimate there 103,707?
Yes, it is.
So is this the source of the information in your report?
Yes.
Now, you'd spoken earlier about coupling rates. Is that correct? That the rates of which people form couples and that could possibly change among the same-sex community if they were permitted to marry.
I spoke of the importance of understanding the rate of couple formation or household formation if you are attempting to estimate the number of weddings in a given year, and that you can't simply look at the number of same-sex existing couples in a static sense and expect that the number of weddings should match that, because households form and there are migration effects.
Okay. And do you have an estimate of the number of gay and lesbian individuals that there are in San Francisco?
I don't have that estimate, no.
And to make that estimate, one piece of data you would need would be the total population of San Francisco. Is that correct?
And depending on how you would make the estimate, that could be a helpful piece of information.
Okay. And on the third page of this Census Bureau report, do you see the table labeled place of birth?
Yes, I do.
And it lists the total population at 757,604. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if you could turn to tab 12 in the witness binder. All right, this is an exhibit that's been marked Defendant Intervenors Exhibit 1287, and this is a Williams Institute report called Census Snapshot, California Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual Population. Do you see that?
Yes, I see it.
And you've relied on the Williams Institute work in preparing your report, correct?
I have not seen this document before.
Not this document specifically, but the Williams Institute's work generally.
I've referred to another report prepared by the Williams Institute.
Okay. And to turn to the second page of this report, and the second bullet point on that page, the first sentence says, among California counties, San Francisco has the highest percentage of lesbian, gay men, and bisexuals at 14%. Is that correct?
That's what it says, yes.
Do you have any reason to question that estimate?
I don't, no.
Your Honor, we would move to admit DIX 1287 into evidence.
Your Honor, I don't object.
1287 is admitted.
Okay, now in testifying earlier, you provided an estimate for how much sales tax revenue would be generated by the federal income tax savings that same-sex couples could get if they were permitted to marry. Is that correct?
Yes.
And again, that assumes that the net impact of that is that same-sex couples could actually have a net savings in federal income taxes. Is that correct?
It assumes that same-sex couples would pay a lower amount on average in federal income tax if they were married.
And your figures assumes I believe you stated this, I just wanted to make sure that the same-sex couples spend all of the additional savings that they receive from this lower federal income taxes and that they spend all of it in San Francisco. Is that correct?
Yes, that's an upper-end estimate. They spend all of their additional income in San Francisco on taxable goods.
Have you studied the behavior of people when they obtain tax savings? What amount of it they actually spend?
I did not for the purposes of this. I felt it was sufficient to provide an upper-end estimate. The number is not particularly, dispositive, so.
Now, you also believe that same-sex couples would be entitled to certain other federal benefits if they were permitted to marry. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
And to your understanding, are there federal programs that take spousal income into account when determining eligibility?
Yes, there are.
And if the federal government recognized same-sex marriage, potentially the individuals in those marriages could lose eligibility for programs that took spousal income into account. Is that correct?
I can't think of a specific example, and I'm not sure I can give you a clear answer on that.
If there was an example where there was a threshold of federal of income that was required, you had to have below that income to receive a federal benefit, and the federal government recognized spousal income. Is it not correct that there are some individuals that would, by virtue of that, perhaps go above that threshold that currently they do not?
Okay, I understand your example.
Do you agree with that?
Again, there was no specific program that's coming to mind, but I'm following your example.
Okay. And that, hypothetically, I'm going to ask you to assume that there are programs that take spousal income into account. And to determine the net impact of federal recognition of same-sex marriages, you have to consider the people that could potentially lose eligibility under those programs, as well as individuals that would gain eligibility for other benefits. Is that correct?
To fully discuss and prepare an estimate of the impact of same-sex marriage on income and spending in San Francisco, you'd have to do a full counting of the ones you refer to in which the eligibility may be less, as well as others in which you're only eligible for the benefit if you're married, and you're denied that benefit if you're not married to your partner. So, in order to provide a full estimate, a quantitative estimate, yes, you would need to consider both types.
And you've not attempted to do that?
I have not attempted to estimate either type beyond the taxation issue, which was readily quantifiable.
Now, another source of potential savings, we will move on to another one of your opinions, is the cost associated with San Francisco's Equal Benefits Ordinance. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, permitting same-sex couples to marry in San Francisco will not repeal the Equal Benefits Ordinance, will it?
No, it would not.
And permitting same-sex couples to marry in San Francisco would not cause San Francisco to stop defending the Equal Benefits Ordinance in court, would it?
It would not directly cause that, no.
Okay, and your opinion is that, or your understanding is that San Francisco has expanded a certain amount of money to defending the Equal Benefits Ordinance in court. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
And do you know when these legal expenditures took place?
To the best of my recollection, they have, they've occurred since 1997 or so, when the Equal Benefits Ordinance was adopted.
Do you know if these legal expenditures are ongoing?
I think in principle there are ongoing, and there's a potential risk of expenditures there, but I don't know the specific details.
Okay. If you could please turn to tab 14 in the witness binder, and then there should be an Exhibit A there. And that's an exhibit that's been marked Plaintiff's Exhibit 845. Do you recognize this document?
Exhibit A?
Entitled Hours and Expenses for Matters Involving the Equal Benefits Ordinance.
I don't specifically recollect this document, no.
I will represent to you that this was a document given to us along with your expert report in this case. So you do not recognize or recall reviewing this document?
This is a, yes, this is a document which is the source for the $1.6 million in city costs for defending the Equal Benefits Ordinance.
Okay. Your Honor, I'd like to move Plaintiff's Exhibit 845 into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
Very well, 845 is admitted.
Okay, to your knowledge, Dr. Egan, are either of these cases ongoing?
I don't have any knowledge on that.
Okay, if you could turn to tab 15 in the witness binder. And this is an exhibit that's been marked DIX 2671. And this is a 5-year report on the San Francisco Equal Benefits Ordinance from the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. Do you understand the Human Rights Commission administers the Equal Benefits Ordinance?
That's correct.
Have you seen this document before?
I don't recall the specific document.
To your understanding, does this appear to be an official publication of the city of San Francisco?
Yes.
Your Honor, we would move to admit Defendant Intervenor's Exhibit 2671 into evidence.
Your Honor, we have no objection.
Well, 2671 is admitted.
If you could turn to page 12. And there's a heading that's called Litigation Update. Do you see that?
Yes?
And it says, this past year brought successful closure to most of the litigation challenges facing the Equal Benefits Ordinance since its enactment. 2 of the 3 lawsuits filed against the city challenging the legality of the ordinance have concluded with a majority of the law intact. The 3rd remains on appeal. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it then goes on to list under subtitle A, Air Transport Association case. And I don't know if you recall from the prior exhibit, you can look back at it if you don't, under tab 14-A. But was this the litigation that consumed most of the expenses, the vast majority of the expenses that you have reported in the report?
Yes, it appears that it was.
And according to this, if you go back to page 13, at the very bottom, it talks about a 3rd lawsuit filed by S.D. Myers, and it says that that appeal is pending. Is that correct? The very bottom of page 13.
Yes.
So based on that, that would lead one to conclude that the Air Transport Association case has been concluded. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, do you know if permitting same-sex couples to marry in California will convert existing domestic partners into spouses?
It's my understanding that would not automatically happen.
Did that happen when same-sex couples were permitted to marry in 2008?
To the best of my knowledge, that did not happen.
Okay, and permitting same-sex couples to marry in California will not prevent same-sex couples from entering domestic partnerships? Is that correct?
As far as I know, it would not.
And will permitting same-sex couples to marry in California require other states to permit same-sex marriage?
I don't believe it would.
And San Francisco's contractors have employees across the county to whom they provide benefits under the Equal Benefits Ordinance. Is that correct?
Some do, certainly.
And if you could, please turn to tab 17 in the witness binder. And this is an exhibit that's been marked DIX 698. Do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And what is this document?
This is a document that summarizes the research of a colleague of mine in the Comptroller's office on the city's costs in administering the Equal Benefits Ordinance. And
this was one of the documents you relied upon in forming your opinion in this case?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, we would move for the admission of DIX 698.
No objection, Your Honor.
Very well, 698 is admitted.
And the second paragraph, about halfway through it, states that between, strike that, give me one moment. Okay, my question for you is, does the Human Rights Commission, the employees that they employ to administer the Equal Benefits Ordinance, do they also respond to more general sexual orientation discrimination complaints?
I'm not completely sure on that, but it's my belief that they do.
So even if domestic partnerships were no longer necessary, presumably the Human Rights Commission would still have to respond to these types of complaints. Is that correct?
You mean discrimination-related complaints?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you know how common it is for companies to offer domestic partnership benefits?
I don't have any numbers on that in my head, no.
Okay, and if you could turn to tab 15, this is the 5-year report on the Equal Benefits Ordinance that we just looked at. If you could turn to page 1 of that report after the table of contents in the second paragraph, it says, today over 4,500 employers extend these benefits. Is that correct?
Yes.
These benefits, do you understand to mean domestic partner benefits?
Yes.
If you look at the last sentence of that same paragraph, it says, the concept of employer-provided domestic partner benefits moved from the far fringes of the fringe benefit landscape to become commonplace among employee benefit offerings. Is that correct?
That's what it says, yes.
Do you agree that domestic partnership benefits are commonplace?
I don't have any independent basis to evaluate that statement.
I gather you're moving this exhibit in.
I thought that we had moved this one.
Has it already come in before?
I believe it was moved in, Your Honor.
All right, fine.
Okay, do you know if California has any laws requiring insurance companies and other insurance providers to provide equal benefits to domestic partners?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay, if you could turn to tab 31 in the witness binder. I will represent to you that this is a provision of California law covering group health insurance policies. And the last sentence of subsection A of that states that a policy may not offer or provide coverage for a registered domestic partner that is not equal to the coverage provided to the spouse of an employee, insured, or policyholder. Is that correct?
That's what it says, yes.
Okay, and now if we turn, I believe, 3 pages, there is another provision of California law. This is California Insurance Code Section 381.5, and this covers, according to the last sentence of subsection A, all forms of insurance regulated by this code. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And the sentence prior to that, this law provides that a policy may not offer or provide coverage for a registered domestic partner if it is not equal to the coverage provided for the spouse of an insured or policyholder. Is that correct?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this line of questions. If he is asking if this document says what it purports to say, it's totally unnecessary. If he's asking whether this is the law to the witness, he's being asked for a legal conclusion.
Well, it does seem to me, Mr. Patterson, this is a provision of law. The witness said he wasn't aware of it. You can certainly refer to the provision of law in making your points, and I'm not really sure this is a proper subject for examination of this witness.
Okay, well, he had opined that the cost that the Equal Benefits Ordinance imposed upon San Francisco companies, and I'm just testing the reliability of that opinion.
Well, I think I understand the point that you're making, and I think you've done a good job of making it. Maybe you can move on.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, do you know, Dr. Egan, if other government bodies have enacted equal benefits ordinances similar to San Francisco's?
I'm not completely aware of the prevalence of that.
Okay, and if you could turn to tab 16 in the binder. This has been marked Defendant Intervenors Exhibit 2672, and this is a 7-year update in the San Francisco Equal Benefits Ordinance from the Human Rights Commission. And Your Honor, I'd like to move DIX 2672 into evidence.
We have no objection, Your Honor.
Submitted in evidence.
If you could turn to page 5, the conclusion, second paragraph of the conclusion states that, including San Francisco, by the end of fiscal year 2003 to 2004, there were 13 government bodies with equal benefits legislation on the books. Several more are considering such legislation, all using San Francisco law as a model. Now, if equal benefits ordinances were significantly detrimental economically, do you think all these government bodies would enact them?
Well, that would depend on whether they felt that the economic cost was worth the benefit of remediating discrimination.
So the fact that they do enact them indicates that they think the cost is worth the benefit. Is that correct?
I wouldn't want to try to put myself in their head, but it would seem that's a reasonable conclusion.
And you've stated that the Equal Benefits Ordinance possibly reduces the pool of contractors who are bidding on San Francisco contracts. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And that is because that's a theoretical point. Is that correct? You've not studied whether contractors actually are not bidding on San Francisco's contracts because of the Equal Benefits Ordinance. Is that correct?
No. I mean, it's hard to observe companies when they don't do something, and that would be the case here.
And another opinion that you've provided is that this case is that the city and county could save money on health care that they provide to the uninsured. Is that correct?
Yes.
And your basis for that assumption is just that you believe there's some uninsured members of same-sex couples that would be covered by their partner's private insurance if they were, if they got married. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you've not considered those provisions of the California Code that were referred to earlier in forming that opinion. Is that correct?
In what context?
In the context where they mandate insurance companies to provide equal benefits to spouses, domestic partners. You've not considered that in your assumption that some uninsured members of same-sex couples would be covered if they could get married.
I apologize. I object that the question misstates the law.
Maybe. If you move to the point you're trying to make directly, this is an adverse witness. You can cross-examine him in the old-fashioned way rather than to take his deposition.
Well, the point I'd like to make, Dr. Egan, is you simply have not considered how, whether California law would impact that question. Is that correct?
The question of whether there exists uninsured people in San Francisco whose unmarried partners have private health insurance
Yes.
I have not. Although, based on my quick reading of the law in front of me, it only requires that domestic partner benefits not be less than married partner benefits. It doesn't really require them to provide domestic partner benefits.
Okay. Well, I'm not here to ask you about your understanding of the law.
Okay.
You simply don't know how many gay and lesbian couples would get insured were they permitted to marry.
I don't have an estimate of that, no.
And the cost of providing that insurance would just be shifted from San Francisco to the private sector. Is that correct? The cost of their health care essentials.
That's true, although it may be better to think of it as they are being shifted from the uninsured population to the insured population, which is probably a net economic gain from the point of view of society as a whole.
But to answer the question is, the private sector would be picking up for the tab where the public sector now is doing it.
That's correct.
Okay, and now you've also offered an opinion on the cost of providing health services to the LGBT community. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you believe that same-sex marriage, permitting same-sex marriage, could reduce this. Is that correct? These costs.
Yes, that's correct.
And that is because you believe extending marriage to same-sex couples would lessen discrimination against members of the LGBT community.
That seems like a reasonable assumption to me, yes.
And you're not a sociologist or a psychologist, or are you?
I'm not, no.
So that's not an expert opinion that would incur. Is that correct?
No, it's not.
Okay, and you believe that San Francisco has a brand as a popular tourism destination for gay individuals. Is that correct?
I just draw that conclusion based on the number of out-of-state same-sex marriages that we hosted.
And you believe that San Francisco is a particular attraction for gay and lesbian tourists?
I wouldn't. I don't have any direct information to compare San Francisco to other places in that regard, but I wrote that I thought it was, yes.
Okay, and yet, generally, do you think San Francisco is a gay-friendly city?
I would say so in general, yes.
In light of these things, do you still believe that same-sex or gay and lesbian individuals have elevated rates of behavioral health services because of the psychological effects of the discrimination they endure in San Francisco?
And that's what I've been told by our Department of Public Health, and I don't have any reason to doubt that statement.
You haven't done any independent research on that yourself?
It's not my field, no.
Okay, and the next subject you opined upon is the costs incurred because of bullying in the San Francisco school district. Is that correct?
Yes.
And your opinion on that subject is based solely on the report of the economic cost of bullying at school that you reference. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You haven't done any independent study on that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The report did not directly address the experience in San Francisco. Is that correct?
That's correct. It was California.
It's true, is it not, that
Okay.
That-
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, finally, you've talked about well, it's true that you've talked about, is it not that you've talked about economic advantages of marriage that cannot be quantified? Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you believe there's research supporting the statement that there's a significant economic advantages to marriage. Is that correct?
I'm aware of that research, yes.
That research does not study same-sex married couples, does it?
To my knowledge, it does not, right.
I'd like to turn to tab 19 in the witness binder. This is a Rand Institute study, Marriage, Assets, and Savings. It's been marked PX 809. Do you recognize that document?
Yes, I do.
And this is a study that you relied upon for your opinion that married couples generate more wealth than single couples, the single people, correct?
That's correct.
And this does not address same-sex married couples, does it?
It does not.
Your Honor, we move to admit PX 809 in evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
very well, 809 is in.
If you could turn to tab 20 in the witness binder, please, Dr. Egan. And this has been marked PX 807. It's a press release form. It looks like the Agency for Health Care Research and Quality. And this is what you relied upon for your opinion that married men are more likely to be engaged in healthy behaviors than single men. Is that correct?
This and the article to which it refers, yes.
Okay. And this is the only item that you included in the materials considered portion of your expert report. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the studies reported here did not, as far as we can tell, consider same-sex marriages. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, if you turn to tab 21. Your Honor, I'd like to move PX 807 into evidence. I believe I neglected to ask you that.
No objection.
Very well, 807 is admitted.
If you could please turn to tab 21, Dr. Egan. And this has been marked Plaintiff's Exhibit 803, and this is data from the California Health Interview Survey that you relied upon for your opinion that unmarried men have more emotional and mental health problems than married men. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
I'd like to move exhibit number PX803 into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
803 is in.
All right, this does not break down same-sex and opposite sex marriages, does it?
That's correct.
So you don't have any research that supports your view that the advantages of opposite-sex marriage would flow to same-sex marriages. Is that correct?
My research doesn't make any distinction.
Your research does not include same-sex married couples. Is that correct?
Most of my research predated when same-sex marriage was legal at any point in the United States.
Okay. Now, you've not considered the impact on opposite-sex couples in San Francisco that extending marriage to same-sex couples may have. Is that correct?
I have not.
And it's true. Is it not that if opposite-sex couples got married at lower rates than they did before, that it could offset the benefits you see from same-sex marriage? Is that correct?
If it were the case that same-sex marriage reduced the marriage rate for opposite-sex couples, then yes, that would be that could have an impact.
And if you turn to tab 22 of the witness binder, I believe this is already in evidence. This is the marriage license appointment data, and this is data from the year 2007 as well as from the year 2008. And I will represent to you that from the data, June 17th to November 4th, 2008, there were 3,239 opposite-sex marriages. That from the date June 17th to October 31st, 2007, just a few days shorter, there were 4,009 opposite-sex marriages, and that's there's a column that says actual marriage licenses, and for opposite-sex couples for both the year 2008 and 2007. Do you see that? Do you see that data there?
I'm not seeing the numbers you're referring to.
Well, the numbers are broken down by month, and I have a.
You're looking at the annual totals, or are you?
I'm looking at the months during which same-sex marriage was legal in 2008, and those same dates in 2007.
Right.
And I'm representing to you that I have added up those figures, and that in 2008 there were more than 700 fewer opposite-sex marriages in San Francisco than there were in 2007.
Marriage license appointments?
Marriage licenses, actual marriage licenses issued.
Okay.
So if that's true, that means that less opposite-sex couples married in San Francisco during the time that same-sex marriage was legal than the comparable time the prior year, correct?
It would seem to me, looking at this data, that in some of the months there were fewer opposite-sex weddings, and in some of the months there were more, and that your general statement about the year seems to be correct for that one pair of years.
And I've actually just added up those months during which same-sex marriage was legal in order to account for some months more, some months less.
I understand, but for example, June 17th, 2008 to June 30th, 2008, there were 548 opposite-sex marriage licenses and 1,076 same-sex. In the previous and year during that same period, there was only 462 opposite. So for that 2-week period, there was an increase.
Right, but for the period as a whole, there's a decrease.
For the 4 or 5 month, for that multi-month period, there was a decrease.
Okay, and Dr. Egan, you've testified that you teach at the University of California at Berkeley, is that correct?
That's correct.
And your courses are focused on the economic analysis of subnational and sub-state areas, such as cities and metropolitan areas. Is that correct?
That's right.
And one course, at least one course that you've taught, was essentially a study of why the economics of cities differ from one another and what policy steps can be taken to achieve industrial growth, correct?
Yes.
And same-sex marriage did not come up in that course, is that correct?
That's correct.
It's not come up in any of the courses that you've taught, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now if you could turn to tab 23 of the witness binder. This is an exhibit that's been marked, Defendant Intervenor's Exhibit 854. Do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
And was this the economic strategy document that you helped San Francisco put together when you were at ICF?
That's correct, yes.
Your Honor, we would like to admit Defendant Intervenor's 854 into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
Very well, 854 is in.
And you were the project manager of this project, is that correct?
Yes, I was.
I know this is a lengthy document, but anywhere in here does it mention same-sex marriage?
I don't believe it does. It likely doesn't mention many of the things that we study in the Office of Economic Analysis, policy issues that have a material economic impact on the city. I mean, this is really a study of the macroeconomic infrastructure that drives San Francisco's economy. It's not meant to be an exhaustive catalog of all the possible policy steps, particularly state policy steps, that could impact the city's economy in a significant way.
Okay, but it's safe to say that same-sex marriage is not part of the San Francisco economic strategy as set forth in this document. Is that correct?
It is true that by 2007, same-sex marriage was not a policy option available to the city and county of San Francisco.
Okay. Now, well, if you turn to tab 24, I just want to briefly discuss this National Elevator Industry Benefit Plan that was introduced on your examination. This says that first of all, do you know what the National Elevator Industry benefit plan is?
It's my understanding it's a union.
Okay. And this says that it's based in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. Is that correct?
That's what it says, yes.
Do you know if the union has members in California?
I don't recall. I don't know. I don't believe that I know that one way or another.
Okay. And the only information you have about this union's benefit plan is this letter. Is that correct?
That's right.
And in the first sentence it says that it's addressing the letter to someone who attempted to enroll their same-sex partner into the benefit plan. Is that correct?
Yes, it does.
Okay. It doesn't indicate that that person or their same-sex partner is married, does it?
Not directly, but it does say based on their change of policy that redefines marriage to remove the person of an opposite-sex clause. On that basis, it says to the addressee, you may reapply for coverage, which leads me to suspect that they're married to their partner.
Another possibility is that the National Elevator Industry Benefit Plan would construe a domestic partner relationship as a marriage for the purpose of their benefit plan. Is that correct?
Well, no. It says on the first page. Further, the SPD provides on page 24 that the word spouse refers only to a person of the opposite sex who is husband or wife, and there's no reference to domestic partnership.
I believe husband. I believe that's a provision that is going to change.
Right, but it's not. The provision changes to provide that. A participant who has legally married a person of the same sex under laws of this state, if such a marriage is recognized in his state with a properly and legally binding marriage certificate, may be eligible to enroll his same-sex spouse in any iHealth benefit plan. Seems to me that's explicitly excluding domestic partner.
That's not language actually from the plan. That's letters language construing the plan. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. I mean, it is simply attempting to convey to a member what their rights are, and it doesn't mention domestic partnership, and it appears to define the affected relationships in a way that is clearly limited to marriage.
I have no more questions, Your Honor.
Very well. Redirect, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Egan, I will be very brief. But before I begin, Your Honor, there is one point I would like to clear up for the record. Did I understand correctly that the court took judicial notice of the 5 hate crimes reports that I mentioned earlier, but did not ask the witness about?
Was it 4 or 5?
I believe it's 5, PX 0672 through 676.
No, I did not. I don't believe I was asked to take judicial notice of those.
Your Honor, I would like to ask the court to take judicial notice of those as official government documents and also documents that were authenticated by the Attorney General in response to requests for admissions.
Mr. Patterson?
I have no objection, Your Honor.
Very well.
Thank you, Your Honor.
We'd better recite precisely what exhibits these are.
Yes, they are PX 672, PX 673, PX 674, PX 675, and PX 676.
Very well, thank you.
Dr. Egan, you were asked some questions about whether domestic partner celebrations occurred or were expended money on celebrating their domestic partnerships. Do you recall that by Mr. Patterson?
Yes.
Are you aware of any studies about domestic partnership celebration expenditures?
No, I'm not aware of any such study.
And are you aware of whether or not San Francisco experienced an uptake in wedding-related economic activity in 2008 when same-sex marriage was legal?
Well, certainly San Francisco experienced an uptake in weddings, and I could conclude from that that the economic activity associated with weddings increased as well.
And are you aware of research that people spend money on weddings, have out-of-town guests, and spend money when they are tourists in San Francisco?
There is a significant industry that helps people spend money on their wedding and provides tourism associated with that. There's a lot of evidence that there is a wedding industry.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Egan. Let's talk about your 2008 report, about which you were asked some questions on cross-examination. You talked a little bit about differences between that report and the analysis that you did today. Is there any difference between the per-wedding expenses, if the per-wedding costs that you saw between the 2008 report and the report you prepared, and your opinions in this case?
We made the same assumption. Well, we used the same source of information related to how much wedding expenses are in both cases.
I see. So that assumption was consistent?
Yes.
And when you looked at wedding expenses, did you use that at wedding industry data that we have just discussed?
Yes, we did.
And you also talked about some differences in the methodology that you used to determine the number of weddings that you projected would occur. Is that right?
That's right.
And why did you change your methodology between the 2008 report and your estimates in this case of the number of weddings, of same-sex weddings, that we would expect to see?
When I was asked to do the report in 2008, I was looking, as I always do, for similar research that had tried to address the same question to see if I could learn anything from their methodology. And I found the Williams Institute report on the economic impacts of marriage in California, and thought it would be good to rely on a third-party source for methodology. So what I did to project the number of weddings for the 2008 report was to estimate, using the census data, following as closely as I could the Williams Institute methodology, how many unmarried same-sex partners are there in California, and then, as they did for their study, look to Massachusetts, their experience, and say what percentage of them would get married in each year. And that led me to my estimate of the 3-year number of weddings that is contained in my 2008 report for the residents. I did something else for the non-residents that was built on San Francisco's experience during 1 month in 2004. And the main issue, however, is that that methodology significantly underestimated what we actually saw from June 2008 to November 2008. And I realized that it would not make sense to reapply a methodology in consideration for this case that had undercounted the actual number of marriages in 2008, even though that approach from the Williams Institute does have the advantage of giving an annual estimate and does have the advantage of bringing in the experience of another place. I thought it would be simpler and more straightforward to say, this is what we experienced. We, the city and county of San Francisco, during this period in 2008, I don't see any reason that would change if Proposition 8 were lifted and same-sex couples could marry again in San Francisco. I think the past is a pretty good estimate of the future, at least in the short term.
See, in essence, you changed your methodology to reflect the experience. Is that correct?
Correct. I tried to improve the methodology this time around.
And you also fielded a couple of questions about whether you should have changed the methodology to account for what happened in other states. I asked you to assume that after 2008, Connecticut had legalized same-sex marriage. Would that cause you to revise your projections for San Francisco?
Not really, no.
Why not?
I don't think a significant amount of the weddings in San Francisco would come from Connecticut residents. And as I was saying earlier, the mere fact that a couple could get married in Connecticut wouldn't mean that they wouldn't come to San Francisco to get married.
We also talked about the short-term nature of your projections with respect to the number of same-sex couples who would marry in San Francisco. And you were asked to compare some census data with your projections. Do you know whether everyone who gets married lives together before marriage?
I don't know that.
And the projections that you made in your opinions for this case, are they short-term or long-term projections?
They're short-term projections.
Assume that the short-term turns out to be very short. Does that change your ultimate conclusion that denying marriage to same-sex couples has negative economic impacts on San Francisco with respect to wedding expenditures?
No. The actual numbers only affect the magnitude of the impact, but there is an impact in any event.
Is there wedding-related activity that you would expect going into the future in the long term if couples were permitted to marry?
Certainly. Because of the migration of people to San Francisco and subsequent formation of couples who elect to get married in the future.
You were also asked about pent-up demand, and you were also asked to look at the county clerk's statistics about opposite-sex couples who had, some same-sex couples who had appointments to get married after November 5th of 2008. Is there anything that happened on November 4th, 2008 that might have affected that, whether people would be signing up for marriage appointments?
I don't think anyone signed up after November 4th. And between November 4th and November 24th, when the report was prepared, I would imagine that might have canceled, that many might have canceled. I don't know, frankly, what the number looked like as of November 3rd, but I would say I can't imagine any reason other than Proposition 8 that would require people, that would make people not want to get married after November 5th.
Okay. You were also asked some questions about the number of uninsured partners of same-sex couples for whom one member of the partnership is employed. The other one does not have access to insurance. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes, I do.
Let me ask you, are you an expert on California insurance law?
No, I'm not.
Are you an expert on ERISA and any preemptive effects it may have about benefits plan?
No, I'm not.
Are you an expert on the extent of applicability of California law to out-of-state insurance companies?
No, I'm not.
Are you aware of research that indicates that companies do, in fact, offer domestic partners benefits less frequently than same-sex partners, or any other information that would lead you to believe that that's the case?
Not compared to, no, I'm not aware of specific research on that question.
If we assume that domestic partners are not insured at the same rates that married couples are insured, does your conclusion that San Francisco's expense for covering uninsured populations hold true? That San Francisco incurs a greater expense because marriage is not legal between same-sex couples?
Yes, because even if someone is a registered domestic partner, based on your assumption they are less likely to have insurance, and therefore there may be more partners who are domestic partners with one partner who is uninsured.
And let's talk a little bit about contracting and the Equal Benefits Ordinance. To the extent that discrimination against same-sex couples and lesbian and gay and bisexual and transgendered individuals exists, would you expect that San Francisco's costs to investigate complaints of discrimination would be higher?
Could you repeat that?
If such discrimination exists, and there is an office charged with investigating such discrimination, does that incur costs?
Certainly. I would say in proportion to the amount of discrimination.
And to the extent that companies do not offer domestic partners equal insurance coverage, as they do with married couples, does that increase San Francisco's contracting costs because of the San Francisco's Equal Benefits Ordinance?
To the extent that it limits our pool of contractors, yes, it does.
And if other local governments also have equal benefits ordinances, would you expect a similar increase in their contracting costs from their efforts to combat marriage discrimination?
I would expect the same thing to hold there as well.
And Dr. Egan, you asked a little bit about the rates of opposite-sex couples marrying between June and November 2008. If you were going to undertake a study of the rates at which opposite-sex couples got married, would you look at more than 4.5 months of data to undertake that study?
I think it would be prudent to do that, and yes.
And more data about same-sex couples' marriage rates were available, would you have looked at that here in California to undertake your study of those rates?
Yes.
Dr. Egan, is it generally the case that improvements among lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered individuals and among same-sex couples in health, healthy behaviors, wealth accumulation, and productivity increase San Francisco's payroll and property taxes?
Yes, it is.
And is it generally the case that those factors, increased health and wealth, increase the city's increase the city's economic health?
Yes, they do.
I have nothing further.
Very well. Thank you, sir. You may step down. And can we resume at, say, 1 o'clock? Is that going to give everybody enough time? All right. Very well. Let's see. The next witness is going to be
Dr. Meyer.
Dr.
Dr. Meyer.
Dr. Meyer, fine.